All right, welcome back to the Future Programming Work Group meeting. I guess we'll call this phase two. For those of you who don't know, my name is Chuck McLean. I'm the Chief Public Utility Law Judge at the Commission, and I'm just facilitating the discussions for this work group. I know that we've got some new folks on the calls. I'm not going to go through and have everyone introduce themselves, but if you could just remember to tell everyone your name and what organization you're with when you're asking questions or speaking. I think that'd be helpful for everyone. Some folks are on the phone and don't have access to video and may not know who's speaking. So I think that'll help everyone. Do we have anything preliminary before we turn it over to Exelon? All right, Taylor, you want to take it away?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. This is Taylor Beckham.
You're muted, Taylor. Oh, there you go. And I am recording this meeting just for everyone's, just so everyone knows. I haven't figured out how to live stream this one yet. So.
Okay. So everyone can hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Good morning, folks. I'm Taylor Beckham, an attorney for Pepco Holdings. I am actually going to turn it over to, well, we have with us today Applied Energy Group, and I will let them introduce themselves, but they're going to be presenting on the potential study. But I will just open the door. I have with me today Jessica Yu. And I don't know if Jessica, if you want to give a few preliminary remarks or just turn it right over to AEG, but that's the plan for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Judge. Good morning. My name is Jessica Yu. I'm the Manager of Program Planning, Design, and Evaluation at PHI. I'd like to introduce AEG, who will be presenting the results of the Empowered GHG Potential Study during today's workgroup meeting. To provide some background context, PHI issued an RFP for this study on behalf of the joint utilities back in November of 2021. And in early 2022, AEG, along with our partners, Verdon Associates, the Brattle Group, and Cadeo Group were selected as the vendor to perform this study. Project work began in March of 2022, and PHI has assisted with this study by filing the draft results with the Commission on behalf of AEG on November 14th. PHI also plans to file the final report with the Commission on January 6th of 2023. Now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Eli Morris, Managing Director at AEG, to review the draft results of this study.
Thanks, Jessica. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Judge McLean, and nice to talk to everyone this morning.
And sir, before you jump in too far, I'm assuming you're going to get some questions. You want people to hold them to the end, or you want to take them as they come?
I'm happy to take them as they come.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I am Eli Morris. I'm Managing Director at AEG. I lead our market assessment practice area. I've been at AEG a little over 3 years. Before that, I led DSM planning at PacifiCorp across their 6 states in the Northwest. Even before that, I started my career at a company called Quantec, which was acquired by the Cadmus Group, where I worked on and then led assessments of potential. So I've been leading these studies from one side or the other for about the last 15 plus years, and I've really enjoyed working on this project. Before I get into the slides, a couple of things I wanted to cover. One is I'm a bit under the weather today. I'm going to try to speak up, but if you have any trouble, let me know. Trouble hearing me. And then the other is as we were preparing for this presentation and reviewing results, we did find a couple items that are going to require us to update the potential. So the first is an overstatement of technical natural gas potential. This was limited to just the technical potential and only for the natural gas side. It was something in the workbook in terms of how impacts were associated with energy efficiency and electrification. So we are going to need to update the results for that. It is confined to just the natural gas technical potential, fortunately, but it will require an update. The second is, excuse me, we did understate the administrative costs by a little bit in the models, and we had agreed with stakeholders and utilities on the value to use. We just had a legacy value in there that needs to be updated. That's only going to have a very small impact on the potential. We did have administrative costs, just not the full amount. So that we do expect that to decrease the potential a very small amount for the economic and achievable potential. And we're going to be updating those results. We are updating the results currently, and we expect to be able to provide an updated workbook and PowerPoint by the end of the week. So apologies for the changes. We like to catch these things earlier on in the process, but we do think it's important to update and make sure we have the right numbers in the final results. So I don't think this should materially impact stakeholders' review of the numbers or position on targets, but just wanted to acknowledge that you will be seeing an updated version from the presentation that we're presenting today. So I'm going to try to share my screen and pull up the presentation. The plan today is to go through the presentation that was filed in November. So that's why you'll see the date of November 11th. We haven't developed a separate presentation for today, but we do want to just go through these slides. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, you're good, Eli.
Okay, great. Thank you. And hopefully everyone has had a chance to review the slides and also receive the link to the workbook. If you do have trouble accessing the workbook, please let us know and we can work with you to make sure you can get access to the results workbook. So because these slides have been provided almost a month ago, probably not going to go into as much depth as we might if this was all new content, but really my main focus here is to make sure that everyone understands the context of the study and how to interpret results. And I'll look for the group's guidance on where you might want to spend a little more time or areas where we might not need to go in depth on the slides today. So I talked a little bit about this already. This slide just covers the reporting format. We provided these slides in November for filing based on the commission's order. And as Jessica mentioned, we are working on the final report, which will be finalized by January 6th. And then we also created the reporting workbook that will allow parties to dive a lot deeper onto the results. And that workbook was used to create the graphics that are in this slide deck. And then just to note here that most of what's presented here is in terms of life cycle GHG impacts. If you want to see energy savings or incremental or cumulative savings by year, you can see that in the workbook, but based on the agreement of the future programming work group, we did present, and the guidance we received from the stakeholder group on this study, everything is that we have focused the results on the life cycle GHG impacts of measures. So use of study results, this was a potential study to look at the available potential under different scenarios within the Empowered Utility Service Territory. It was limited to certain behind the meter measures, and we'll talk about what was included in here. Our goal here really wasn't to recommend goals for the Empower utilities, but really to provide the information that could be used by parties and the commission to set those goals. And we want to talk through a number of considerations that will be important in interpreting the results. And then we had a robust stakeholder working group as part of this study, which we'll talk about, and we have laid out a lot of the key considerations that came up through that on slides that we'll go through today. So an overview of the project team, as Jessica mentioned, Applied Energy Group was leading the study, and we're happy to be supported by our partners. AEG has been around for about 40 years. We're about 115 employees, and we support utilities and other organizations across the DSM lifecycle, where we joined Ameresco, an energy services company, in 2011. We do a lot of work in this space, the market assessment space, and potential studies for utilities across the country. And then we also support utility efforts when it comes to program planning and design, implementation, software solutions, and evaluation of programs. So I'm going to see, is Ben on the line?
Ben is not, I'm here.
Okay. And sorry for not introducing the other team members up front, but we are joined by Colin Elliott from Bird & Associates. At AEG, we have Neil Grigsby, who is the project manager from the AEG side, and Ken Walter, who led the analysis, and then Ryan Leddick from the Brattle Group is also on today. So I'm going to be leading most of the presentation, but there are certain parts that they'll be presenting and also available for questions. So Colin, if you could take this slide, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I'll keep it quick. Burton Associates was founded out of the strategic analytics group from Itron. It was the 4 founders took some of their elite employees and me, and they've been doing from that experience at Itron and at Burton these kinds of studies in a variety of jurisdictions, mainly ComEd in Illinois, and then a number in California are the big ones. That's for the market assessment and baseline study. We also have extensive experience in GHG impacts, and Gene Shelton, who's not on the call, and I have been doing potential studies. In fact, Eli and I go back to the Quantech days doing these things. And then the other area where we have expertise is what we call the federation of data sources, which I think is a key aspect of this study, since we're dealing with many utilities and all kinds of different data formats, and getting them into a common framework and clean and defensible is a key step. And with that, I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Colin. And Ryan, can you take this slide?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. Ryan Leddick. I'm a principal with the Brattle Group. I'm located in Portland, Oregon. Brattle is an economic consulting firm headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, but with offices around the US and internationally. We have an energy practice that does work across a broad range of economic and regulatory issues affecting the energy industry. My focus in particular is on demand response and all the exciting stuff that's happening behind the customer's meter these days. So we led the demand response potential portion of this study, which you'll see in more detail in a bit. Just to kind of quickly talk through the slide, we've been pretty extensively involved in a variety of energy-related matters in Maryland over the course of the last several years. Recently we provided a lot of support around the time of use pricing pilot that was part of PC 44, and have done other provided support to other parties in the state as well. You may be familiar with some of our work on demand response. We have a study that's been a pretty widely cited resource for the industry, looking at the national potential for load flexibility. We recently put out a report with the Department of Energy on a national roadmap for developing grid interactive efficient buildings, and going back a bit further, led FERC's study on a national assessment of demand response potential. So in addition to that work that we've been involved in Maryland, obviously we're doing a lot of demand response work in other states and with a variety of clients across the US. So we're bringing that broad perspective to the demand response portion of this. And then a big element of our analysis is really oriented around a model that we've developed that we refer to as load flex, which is the tool that we use to assess the potential impacts of new demand response programs. And you'll see a bit later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about how we use that in the context of this study. So pleasure to be here with everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. And we don't have anyone from Cadeo Group on the call today, but I did want to recognize their contributions to the project. Cadeo has been around since 2014, providing strategic market intelligence to utilities, nonprofits, and other organizations. They work on a lot of these types of complex data collection activities and also potential studies. And they've been helping us on this study with the inputs for the electrification analysis, and also been working to develop some market actor surveys to get some more intelligence into what's happening in the Maryland market. I also wanted to acknowledge everyone who participated in the stakeholder process. This was a lot of work, not only from the AG team, but from everyone who participated. We have a slide on stakeholder engagement, but this really required a lot of input, a lot of review from a lot of different organizations, and we really valued the participation we got from the utilities, from the government agencies, and also from other stakeholders. So I'm not going to read everyone off here, but just wanted to say we really appreciated the level of engagement we got, and the level of review and input we got on key study assumptions and results. So thank you all for your participation. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. Jessica already covered this, and I know the future programming work group is very familiar with this background, but this was for the filing, just some of the background on how we got to this point of an RFP being issued and the AEG being selected to complete this study, and then the commission order setting the timeline for deliverables. Study objectives, this should probably also be pretty familiar to people, but I'll go through these quickly. So we wanted to assess the opportunity specifically for behind the meter GHG abatement from Empower Maryland utilities. So we are not looking at anything on the utility side of the meter, only select behind the meter resources. And this is designed to inform future goals. And like I said, not to opine on or to recommend specific goals, but to provide the information that can be used to set those goals. Gathering up-to-date baseline information was a key part of the study, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And then a robust market potential study that looking at utility specific. We didn't want this to just be statewide. We did build this from the bottom up for specific to each utility, and it does take into account differences between each utility service territory that will be important in the goal setting process. So another key piece here was to understand potential by income. So we did an analysis to understand the number of low-income customers in each and the associated consumption in each utility service territory, and we have split out the results and the baseline for residential customers by income to inform future goals. And then I already talked a little bit about the stakeholder engagement process. That was really important so that we could get the input on what had been discussed to date. I know a lot of work went into thinking about this study and thinking about future goals, and that group was really able to educate us on what had happened to date, and we were able to bring topics to them to get their input so that we could have, we weren't always able to build a consensus, but we really wanted to get the group's input and understand how we should proceed on some of these issues. And then delivering detailed and transparent results that can be easily reviewed by utilities and stakeholders and this group and anyone else who might be interested. So this is the overview of stakeholder engagement. We had bi-weekly calls with the stakeholder group to cover topics that were pertinent at the time. We also scheduled 3 in-depth workshops. So those were up to 4 hours each, and the topics are listed over there on the right. Some of them were more scoping, and then the third one was to review the draft results of the study. And then we did provide interim deliverables along the way. We find that to be an important part of the process here so that we're not just going off, doing the analysis and coming back with results. We're bouncing ideas off of the stakeholders, and also we asked the utilities to review a lot of data as we interpreted the data that they provided. And we really appreciated what they were able to tell us about their customers and to make sure they were reviewing and signing off on that we were using the appropriate values. So we did get a lot of data from the utilities, customer level data, sector level data, and we wanted to make sure we were interpreting it correctly. So on to key study considerations. So the first one here is about the baseline projection. So in our methodology, we always start by projecting energy consumption in the absence of future DSM programs. So this is an important piece of the analysis because it creates that baseline from which we can assess the potential. Typically in these studies, we consider what is happening in the market and we build that into the baseline, but we had a lot of discussion with stakeholders about that on this project. And the guidance we received was that because the Empower goals are set on a gross basis, it was more appropriate to assume that equipment would go in at a minimum efficiency in the baseline projection. And this is most applicable for lighting, and you can see the example there on the right. So the purple line is what we used in the study, which winds up being fairly flat, as it's assumed that the bulbs will be installed that meet the updated ESA standard. Versus the orangish red line, which assumes a high saturation of LEDs, which is what we are seeing in the market. And this is one of those areas where we just wanted to call this out specifically. Not that one method is right and one is wrong, but it is a key consideration in interpreting results and again in leading to goals. So we know that the Empower utilities are transitioning away from lighting programs. There is a significant amount of lighting in the potential that's been identified here because of this assumption. And we just want to highlight that This is really important in the goal setting process. If lighting is not going to be a part of the portfolio, then it's going to be important to adjust the goals, the results of this study, to inform the goals accordingly. This also applies to Energy Star office equipment, primarily in commercial. It applies to other end uses also, but those are the areas where we see the biggest divergence between assuming that equipment goes in at the minimum standard and assuming that it goes in at what we see happening in the market today. And I'm just going to keep going through the slides. Like I mentioned, if questions come up, please just jump in. I'm not sure how to see if there's a chat or if hands are raised on here. I just see my own slides. So
I'll let you know, Eli.
Okay, thank you, Judge. So the next slide here is on policy and emissions. So after the start of the project, the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 was passed. So this did increase, as I'm sure everyone knows, the emissions target from what had previously been in place. So up to 60% of 2006 emissions by 2031. And we had a lot of discussions about this, and we appreciated MDE participating in those discussions. MDE had developed the GGRA plan, but that was based on the previous target. So I know they're working on an updated plan based on the new target, but that wasn't available to inform this study. One of the scenarios that we talked about, and we'll talk about on an upcoming slide here, was a scenario where Empower goals aligned with these reductions. So what we had to figure out was, what does that goal look like? So you can see over on the right, the baseline projection, and that dashed black line that's the goal that we developed. So that was based on input from MDE and a recommendation of assuming a 45% decrease in building greenhouse gas emissions relative to what we came up with for the 2021 emissions. So because our study is only going through 2029, it didn't align perfectly with the 2031 goal, and definitely recognizing there's more work to be done for MDE to analyze the plan to get to the new goal. That's at least what we set as the target that we were going to measure results against. And then also important to note here that we are assuming declining emissions factors for electric generation. So you can see the green there on the graph is, even though energy consumption may be increasing, electricity consumption, we are projecting that emissions are declining because we are assuming that the electricity generation and imports into the state are becoming less carbon intensive. So that's something important to think about when thinking about targets, because over time, each kilowatt hour saved is going to make, under these assumptions, each kilowatt hour saved has a lower greenhouse gas emissions impact. So on to scenarios. So we looked at 5 scenarios of potential here. These are standard, basically, across the industry of how these studies are run. So technical potential, looking at everything that's feasible, regardless of the cost and whether it's cost effective and what customers might actually do. So we're just looking at every opportunity that's out there and assuming that when customers have the opportunity to upgrade their equipment, they're upgrading to the most efficient option in every instance. Economic potential limits that to only cost-effective measures, but still assumes that every cost-effective opportunity is being implemented. And we did a lot of work on this study with Joe Loper and other stakeholders to understand the future programming work group agreement on cost effectiveness and to apply that in the study. We did receive updated avoided costs. I understand those avoided costs might be updated again before the next target setting process, but just to let everyone know, these are updated from what's being used in the current program cycle. And then we considered 3 achievable potential scenarios: a business as usual scenario that more or less assumes that programs continue operating as they are today, a maximum achievable potential scenario that is less constricted by spending and also by the programs that the utilities are currently offering. And we'll cover that on the next slide also. And then an achievable potential GHG goal achievement scenario. So this scenario was intended to look at if that goal I talked about on the previous slide, if the maximum achievable potential wasn't sufficient to reach that goal, this would look at, well, how much would you need to reduce the cost effectiveness threshold to reach that goal. So this was intended to provide some information on how far would the Empower utilities need to go to contribute to that goal. But also we agreed that if the technical potential wasn't sufficient to get to the goal, then this scenario wouldn't be necessary, because that would be a key finding from the study. So the graph or the table on the right shows the resources that were included in each of the scenarios. So for technical potential, we're looking at energy efficiency and building electrification. Same for economic. We don't find those to be very valuable metrics for demand response, just because from a technical standpoint, you could control every piece of equipment, but really that's not how it's going to work in the marketplace. So we really focused on achievable potential for demand response. And then, as I mentioned, the business as usual is really focusing on what the utilities are doing today. So we did exclude building electrification from that. We had a lot of discussion about that assumption, and we weren't able to reach consensus on that topic. So ultimately, AEG made the decision that we would try to stick with the language from the RFP, which was more about current funding levels and current activity for the business as usual scenario. And when we get to results, you'll see that leads to some pretty big differences between the business as usual and the maximum achievable. There are other drivers of differences there, because we do assume different achievability rates, even for energy efficiency, but the exclusion of electrification is probably the biggest contributor to the difference between those scenarios. And so this slide is specific to the GHG goal achievement scenario. The graph on the right shows what we found relative to that GHG goal. This graph will be updated a little bit for what I talked about at the beginning, just because the blue line is going to move up a little bit, because the technical potential for the natural gas is overstated currently. But what we found is that none of these levels of potential are expected to reach that line, that GHG achievement goal. And so we didn't wind up running the the achievable scenario. But we did note here a few things that limitations in our study that, this is not to say that it's not possible to reach that goal, but given the modeling assumptions we made, and we wanted to call those out here of some of the limitations we put on this. So for example, we're only looking at upgrades to equipment at the end of their useful life, from both an energy efficiency standpoint and from an electrification standpoint. If you wanted to, it is higher cost to replace that equipment earlier, but you would also see the benefits sooner. So for a measure that has a 15-year measure life, we assume roughly 1/15 becomes available each year. So because this is only a 6-year study, we're only getting a portion of those units either upgraded or converted to electricity. But if you really wanted to focus on that early replacement, early electrification, that's something that could affect the results here. Similarly, retrofit opportunities, we're assuming that they would be achieved. So this is things like insulation. This is not, we make a distinction between measures that make the equipment more efficient, and then those that just reduce the energy consumption. So those retrofit opportunities, in theory, they could be achieved at any point. The homes are there to be insulated, but there are limitations on how quickly you could do it. For this study, we assumed that would happen over 20 years, so only 6/20ths are included in the study here, but that could be accelerated at additional cost. So we wanted to call out some of those caveats here, just to say that this is not, the finding is not that it's not possible to reach that goal, but just given the limitations we put on the potential, some of the assumptions we made, our finding was that even the technical potential wouldn't hit that identified goal. So building electrification, we wanted to just note some of the limitations in the analysis. Some of them I already talked about. So we are looking at just space and water heating in residential and commercial buildings. We didn't look at industrial electrification or transportation electrification. This was assessed only at the time of normal equipment replacement, like I just mentioned. So the opportunity, the cost, and the magnitude could change if you wanted to look at early replacement, early conversion of equipment. When we only looked at, for natural gas, we only looked at the Empower utilities. So we did not consider the impacts of conversion of Columbia gas equipment in the territories that are served by Empower electric utilities. We only looked at the Washington Gas Light and BGE for natural gas conversion. And we did look at oil and propane in all of the jurisdictions. This is just specific to natural gas. And then when you see impacts of building electrification, those are the net impacts. So we considered what was the previous equipment using and what would the new equipment use, or what would the emissions be, and we are reporting the net impacts there. And based on conversations with stakeholders, we're assigning those net impacts all to the electric utility, because the assumption is that it would be the electric utilities that would be paying for this conversion. And then cost effectiveness was assessed using the same inputs as for energy efficiency, but looking at both fuels, the cost and benefits of reducing the previous fuel, and then the increased cost of providing the new fuel. So for demand response, I'm going to ask Ryan to jump in.
Sure, and just a few comments here to provide everyone with some context for the scope of the demand response analysis. So as many of you probably know, demand response is different than energy efficiency in the sense where energy efficiency is, the goal is to reduce overall energy use. The goal of demand response is to reduce usage or demand during specific times when it's needed on the grid and when it's most valuable. So by nature, demand response is more of an event-based dispatchable option compared to energy efficiency. And most traditional kind of conventional demand response programs typically have a very limited number of events that can be called in order to ask customers to reduce their usage during those specific times, in order to mitigate or avoid inconvenience that would be experienced by the customer if their load were being interrupted more frequently. Because of that limitation, and the fact that typical conventional demand response programs can't be used very frequently, what that means is even if those programs are being called during days with the highest GHG emissions, there's such a limited number of hours per year that those programs can be called that those programs are not going to directly contribute to the same kind of significant levels of reduction in GHG emissions that we would see from the electrification or energy efficiency measures that were included in this study. So as a first step, when we approached the demand response analysis, was we just sort of stepped back and said, okay, what are those demand response programs that really could provide a potentially material reduction in GHG emissions? And with that kind of question as our starting point for defining the scope of the demand response study, what we ended up focusing on were those programs that do allow you to curtail load or shift load on a frequent basis. Something up to potentially shifting a customer's load around on a daily basis. And if you get to that level of management of a customer's load, then coming into the study, we felt that there was at least the potential for that type of program to provide a meaningful impact on GHG emissions, because you could very frequently be shifting load from hours when you have higher emitting resources on the margin to hours when you have lower emitting or renewable resources on the margin. So all the demand response programs that we analyzed here were programs that provide that daily or at least very frequent load shifting capability. And those are the programs that you're seeing listed in this table on the right-hand side of the slide. So we looked at programs that managed water heating, electricity use, and because water heaters have a tank that stores energy in the form of thermal storage, those provide you with that buffer that allows you to get that frequent load shifting benefit. Time of use rates provide a daily price signal that encourages load shifting. EV managed charging is an option that we view as being available on a frequent basis. And then managing certain end uses in an automated way in commercial and industrial facilities and managing behind the meter batteries are also options that we see for providing this frequent load shifting capability. So that was the scope of the demand response analysis in terms of the programs or measures that we analyzed. Because of that, all of the potential that we analyzed for demand response is new. There aren't daily load shifting programs available at scale in Maryland that we could identify. So everything we quantified here was new relative to what exists today. To model the impacts of the electric vehicle managed charging programs, we needed an assumption about the number of EVs that would be on the road in Maryland in each year of the study horizon. As our basis for that, we assumed achievement of Maryland's state policy goals, which gets to about 300,000 EVs on the road by 2025. To model, because demand response programs are dispatchable, we needed to basically simulate the dispatch of these programs in order to quantify their value. And so, in my kind of opening comment, when I mentioned that we have this load flex model, basically what that model allows us to do is to look at an hourly profile of system costs and marginal emissions rates, and then simulate the dispatch of these programs in a way that would maximize their overall value to the system. And so that's the basic approach that we took on the demand response side to estimating the overall value or benefits of these programs. And then lastly, and this is a point that we'll get to a bit later in the presentation, all of the GHG benefits that we quantified for demand response here are direct benefits. So if you're reducing load during peak hours of the day, the GHG benefit that we're quantifying is the reduction in emissions associated with those generators that don't run because of that reduced load. As we'll mention, we see there also being a lot of indirect benefits of demand response and load flexibility, which were outside indirect GHG reduction benefits, which were kind of outside of the scope of what we could do in this study, but qualitatively we acknowledge those as being an important consideration when it comes to demand response in a greenhouse gas abatement context as well. So there's just a few things that hopefully give you a sense for kind of the boundaries of the analysis that we did on as it relates to demand response.
Thanks, Ryan. And then on the baseline study, is Ben on or Colin?
I'm on. There's a hand up though. Scott.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. Scott Filey, DHCD. I just wanted to verify something that you said, Eli. For electrification, were you saying that the assumption was the electric utility would pay for that fuel switch?
Essentially, yes. If it came to Empower programs.
Sure.
So, yes.
All right. Thank you. I just want to make sure I heard that right.
Sure. Okay. Go ahead, Colin.
So for everyone who has been here from the start, you'll remember that the initial intent was to conduct a baseline study as part of the potential study, where that baseline study would directly inform it. That was an ambitious goal from the start, but with delays from numerous sources, that became not feasible. That said, the decision was made to go forward with it anyway, so that we would still have those data. We'd do all the data collection anyway. The surveys for that baseline study were in the field in September and October. We have those. I would say at this point they're done, processed, weighted, and cleaned, and we are now working on basically producing a variety of dashboards and the main report for the statewide results. I think it says, the 16th of December is when we plan to have those. Obviously, that raises the question of, what's different in the baseline study versus the previous results that AEG used, and that's another thing that we're working on is working with AEG to compare the results from the baseline study with what they use to see, where there's big differences that actually have implications, and we'll use that to inform any updates to the potential study. And that's it.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, we certainly would have preferred to have the new baseline data flow directly into the potential study. but we were able to use the old baseline study that AEG conducted as part of the previous SemPower potential study in 2015, and then also able to look at some market trends from the EIA, Energy Information Administration, RECs and CBECs, for example, to try to get good estimates of what's happening in Maryland, what the current building stock looks like, though we do think that this information that Verdant's been collecting, aside from just looking at differences between those two sources, still will have a lot of value when it comes to program planning and other efforts. So even though it didn't flow directly into the potential study results we're presenting today, we still think this was a really valuable exercise to do an updated baseline study. Okay, well, I'll pause there before we get into the results and just see if there are any questions or comments from the group.
Not seeing any hands up, Eli, so.
Okay, then I'll keep going. Thanks. So these are the highest level study results. So this is all utilities combined for each of the 4 levels of potential you'll see over on the right. So technical, economic, and the 2 achievable cases. And then we have split the green is the electric energy efficiency, the purple is the natural gas energy efficiency, and the red is the electrification. So we've found that the electric energy efficiency is the largest potential in each of these scenarios. And part of that is driven by assumed electrification. So we are assuming that when units get electrified, they're installed at high efficiency, but that still creates new opportunities. So if you convert a furnace to a heat pump, now if you insulate that home, you're saving on the electric side, not the natural gas side. So this interaction is taken into account in our model. And also, again, important to note that these are lifetime GHG emissions reductions. So they do take into account the lifetime of the equipment and also take into account the changing electric emissions over time. So this is where you can see that even though we might be projecting, we probably are projecting increasing energy savings in each year on the electric side, it actually translates to lower lifetime GHG emissions because of that assumed decline in the emissions factors. And then related to that, you'll see the yellow is demand response, only in the maximum achievable case. And it looks small because the demand response we're assuming is a 1-year measure life. You have to repurchase it essentially every year. You're paying customers incentives to participate every year, whereas a lot of the energy efficiency and electrification measures may last for 15 or 20 years. And that's factored into the lifetime emissions reductions here. Again, when we see electrification, that's the net impact between the 2 different the 2 different fuels. So this is not just the reduction of the original fuel. It also does factor in the new emissions from the electric side. So we're going to go into a little more detail here on the statewide results. So energy, and these were really developed from talking to the stakeholders on what levels of potential were valuable to see in the presentation. For those of you who have looked at the workbook, we do provide very detailed measure level results that you can use to summarize the potential however you'd like and look even at a detailed measure level. I think it's large. It's I think a couple 100,000 rows of data, which was one of the challenges with putting it into Excel, but we did want to provide that level of detail in addition to the summaries we created here. So this is a summary by sector. You can see the residential and commercial are roughly equivalent in the maximum case. And then for the business as usual, commercial winds up being a little bit higher. That's because we did find more electrification to be cost effective on the residential side. So when we remove electrification from the business as usual scenario, that shifts a little bit. This is largely driven by the baseline characteristics of the utilities. So that's a key point in our process, is characterizing the load by sector, by end use, by technology in the base year and then in the baseline. And so that really drives a lot of this distribution by sector. And when we get into the building types, that's a big driver of what the utilities customer composition is. So that's a big driver here of the distribution by sector. But then we are looking at all the building types, all of the applicable measures, which are also driving some differences across the sectors. And industrial is fairly small, is what we found in terms of the potential here. And again, does not include any electrification.
Eli, you got a question. Garrett?
Thanks, Judge. Yeah, one quick question. And I'm sorry if I missed this. Did you say what electricity fuel source mix you're assuming or emission factor you're assuming here? And like, is that based on current? Is that based on compliance with the renewable portfolio standard? And is that changing over time? I guess I'm wondering, as we look at the emission savings by year, how much of that is due to the improved efficiency versus changes in the assumed fuel source mix that might result in some GHG benefit on their own, even if we used exactly the same amount of electricity?
Yeah, great question. So we are assuming a declining emissions factor over time. So we don't have the values in here. They are in the workbook. There's a sheet, and we worked with MDE to get those values from the GGRA plan. And again, they may be updating those, but this graph kind of shows that decline. We just used data provided by MDE. They helped us translate their assumptions into emissions per kilowatt hour. So that's what we used, and it does assume a decrease, but we didn't make explicit assumptions about the generating sources. We just used the data that MDE was using.
Thanks.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. So now we'll go into each sector. So residential, I mentioned before, we wanted to capture potential by income, and you can see that on the left, in addition to by building type. Again, this is largely driven by the composition of the utilities customers in the baseline. So you can see most of the potential is from single family homes that do not qualify as low income. You can also see how much is coming from multifamily and then from low income customers in both of those segments. And then on the right, so that looking at the left, again, a big difference here is the inclusion of electrification, but similar story when we look at business as usual within the residential sector, mostly from single family. And then we went a little more depth here by end use. So
Eli, you got a question? I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay.
Sammy. Dr. Qualja?
Oh, yes, sir. I apologize. I couldn't find the button. Hi, Eli. And hi, Colin. Hi, Sammy Kawaja with Cadmus. And I also go back to the days of Quantic with these two fine gentlemen. I just have a quick question on this income-based potential, Eli. And it's so much smaller on the limited income. Is that just by the sheer number of customers, not necessarily a potential per customer, right? Because I would think the potential per customer is higher on the limited income than it is for a non-low income single family.
Yes, so this is not per customer. This is total.
The total.
And it also factors in the cost effectiveness. So even though there are some non-energy benefits that are applied to only to low income customers, the measures may not be as cost effective in some of those homes. But yes, this is total. So this is not a per home value.
Okay, I guess I'm a bit surprised by the size of it. What's your definition of limited income? Just curious, what is that? Just federal poverty line?
I may need Ken to remind me about this. Ken, do you know offhand our definition that we used for low income? I think it may have been 80% of
median.
We have to get the answer back to you on that one.
No worries, because I mean, if you use what we're currently using, which is 250% of the federal poverty, there's approximately 28% of the total single-family homes are indeed limited income. So I would have expected to see more potential than what the graph shows.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we'll look into that. Okay, and then this is the potential by end use. Again, on the left, including electrification, space heating is quite large because most of that potential is, well, the electrification potential is all in space and water heating. And then, as I noted on one of the early slides, we are still seeing a good amount of lighting potential here, and that's driven by that market baseline assumption. So again, that's something that should be considered when setting the targets for the next round. And then you see the relative share of other end uses like cooling, electronics, appliances, and then miscellaneous. And then this was a question that we received from stakeholders, an important piece here. So we did separate it by equipment and non-equipment. So I talked a little bit about this earlier, that equipment are those measures that affect the actual efficiency of the equipment. So this is upgrading your air conditioner to a SEER 17 unit versus non-equipment, which are measures that affect the consumption but don't affect the efficiency of the equipment. So for example, insulation. And this is energy efficiency only. This was removing the impacts of electrification. So this gives some insight into what we were seeing by the relative share of equipment and non-equipment measures. So most of this is still in the equipment is what we were seeing here, but fairly even distribution between equipment and non-equipment measures. So commercial, we model a lot more building segments here. And again, the potential is really largely a function of the mix of customers in the baseline. So fairly even distribution across all these segments, though you'll notice we split small and large office. You combine those, office is the largest contributor to the potential. But this gives some idea of the distribution of potential across the different market segments in the commercial sector. And again, by end use, this is where it really stands out, the lighting baseline. We are seeing a lot of the data sources we typically use are showing a lot of LED lighting in commercial facilities, but we are assuming a minimum standard baseline here. So again, lighting should be closely reviewed in terms of what will actually be offered through the next round of Empower programs, but it is contributing a large share to the consumption here of a large share of the GHG emissions reductions from the commercial sector. And then similarly, you can see the split of equipment and non-equipment here. We do treat lighting as an equipment measure, which is why there's a lot of more of the equipment savings on the commercial side. And then industrial, you can see the distribution of the segments we modeled here. We try to look at the data and identify the segments that are most prevalent in Maryland, and then everything else went into an other industrial. So that's why you see that on the brown. We actually modeled these a little bit differently on the electric side and the natural gas side, which also is one reason why when we combine them, the other industrial is a little bit larger. We didn't model every segment on the natural gas side because there were only about 3 of them that had significant natural gas consumption. So the other segments, which were very small, got rolled into other industrial. And then on the energy efficiency side, similar story on lighting, also seeing impacts on space heating and process and across the different end uses here. You can see the distribution, again, not including any electrification of space heating systems on the industrial side. And then similar distribution of the equipment and non-equipment on the industrial side. So in general, we found that the larger potential is for equipment measures. That's partly for one of the assumptions I mentioned earlier, the assumption that these retrofit or non-equipment measures are being acquired over a 20-year period. If you were to try to accelerate the adoption of those, then the non-equipment would have a larger share of the potential. And I'll pass it back over to Ryan.
All right, sounds good. So we have a couple slides on the demand response results. Before we get into the quantitative results, there's just a point that we want to make, basically revisit relative to my earlier comment around the kind of this idea of the direct versus indirect GHG benefits of demand response. As you're going to see on the next slide, those direct GHG abatement benefits that we've estimated for demand response are material. But they're not nearly as big as the impacts that we're seeing from the energy efficiency and electrification programs. So the point that we want to make here is we don't want that sort of narrowly focused finding to become a reason to be interpreted as a reason to sort of de-emphasize the importance of demand response in the energy and decarbonization transition. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is demand response, as we've seen in our analysis, is a very cost-effective resource. And so, aside from the GHG benefits that we're showing here, we view it as a really important tool that will play an important role in making the energy transition affordable as we move away from fossil fuels and kind of carbon-intensive technologies. So that first point is we view demand response as playing a really important role in making all of this affordable. And then in addition to that, we also, as I mentioned, view there as being sort of indirect GHG benefits of demand response that aren't quantified in this study. And so the purple box that you're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide kind of describes some of those indirect GHG benefits of demand response. So the first is with demand response, if you can reduce curtailments of wind or solar at times of day when you have oversupply of renewables relative to load, and you can actually shift load into those hours and absorb and actually utilize that renewables output, you can actually improve the economic attractiveness of those solar resources because they're now getting paid for that output rather than having it being curtailed. And by improving the economic attractiveness of wind and solar, more of it will be built. So demand response indirectly can contribute to GHG abatement by facilitating the deployment of more wind and solar resources on the system. So that's one point to be made here. Another is we view demand response as playing an important role in facilitating the cost-effective adoption of electrification measures. So in particular, if you think about sort of all of the new load that will be coming on the system through building electrification and transportation electrification, if demand response can help to mitigate some of that load growth and avoid the need for infrastructure investments that will enable that electrification to happen more quickly, demand response there again indirectly contributes to facilitating this decarbonization transition. And then similarly along those lines, aside from just making this more affordable, to the extent that there are interconnection constraints associated with electrification and distributed generation, and demand response helps to mitigate some of those interconnection constraints, we'll just see more of these resources coming online faster, and that there's a benefit there as well. So really the point here is just we want to make sure that future resource investment decisions in Maryland consider the benefits of demand response broadly rather than just focusing on the direct GHG impacts of demand response that we've quantified in this study. So that's my speech, and now we will get into the quantified benefits here. So in our analysis, all of those demand response programs that we modeled were found to be cost effective, other than workplace managed charging and small C&I time of use rates. Doesn't necessarily mean that those shouldn't be pursued, and in fact, as part of a bundle or as part of a package, those could be cost effective, but on a standalone basis, those are the only two that didn't pass the cost effectiveness screen. The total cost effective load shifting capability that we analyzed accounts for about 1% to 5% of system peak demand, depending on which utility we were looking at. So this is a sizable portfolio of load shifting programs that we ended up analyzing. The GHG reduction potential ended up accounting for about 0.6% of total annual electricity sector emissions and around 3% of our study's total maximum achievable GHG abatement potential. So again, material, but not the same scale as we're seeing on the energy efficiency or electrification side of things. And then in terms of individual program level impacts, what we were seeing is that both grid interactive water heating and automated DR for larger commercial and industrial facilities tended to provide the majority of the GHG abatement benefit that we estimated. And that's really because those two options have the most flexibility in terms of not only large shares of load being shifted, but also the times of day when you can actually shift that load. As I mentioned earlier, with electric resistance water heating, because you have 50, 80 gallon tank that's storing that hot water, that basically acts like a thermal battery. And you have a lot of flexibility around when you actually heat that load during the day. And that type of flexibility contributes a lot to kind of the relative impact of water heating GHG abatement potential that we estimated here. So those are really the highlights from a DR perspective, but obviously can take any questions and get into details when we get to that point.
Thanks, Ryan.
Oh, we got a hand up. Ryan, don't go anywhere. Dr. Kowalczyk.
Yeah, thanks, Judge. Hey, Ryan, I think first of all, I agree with everything that you said. I mean, those indirect benefits of demand response are absolutely, you're right on. And my comment / question is not intended to decrease anything in terms of the value of DRs, but is the potential of a negative impact from switching to on-site generation significant? Any kind of negative greenhouse gas impacts from that sort of load shifting?
So are you asking if we accounted for the negative GHG impact of using like an on-site generator to?
Yeah.
We didn't, but that's just because that wasn't an option that we modeled in the study. Because we were focused again on these programs that provide near daily load shifting benefits, that essentially ruled out sort of limited use interruptible tariff types of programs, or maybe you would have customers switching over to a backup diesel generator or something like that. That wasn't an option that we considered here, so that there was no negative impact to account for.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So the remaining slides are utility-specific results. We know those are going to be important when it gets to utility-specific target setting, and the workbook provides detail by utility and can be filtered by utility. I wasn't planning to go through the utility-specific slides. They are in the same format as the overall slide. I could do that if, Judge, if you think that would be valuable, but otherwise I would probably suggest stopping here in terms of our presentation.
I'll put it out to the group. Anybody want to see the presentation of the individual utilities, or? I guess they like your idea of stopping here, Eli. All right. All right. So
all right. Well, in conclusion, I'll just say again, we really appreciated all of the input we got from the working group. I specifically wanted to thank the PHI team for guiding us through the study, all the other utilities and everyone else who participated. Really interesting study. Really hope the results are meaningful and useful for the next set of utility goals, and we'll hang on in case there are any other questions.
Yeah, please don't go anywhere. All right. Anybody have any questions based on the presentation?
Judge McLean, I have a few questions. This is Joe Loper with Loper Energy.
But
I wasn't sure whether I should, not just the ones I sent you, but some other ones pertaining to the slides. Should I go for it? Or I don't know what the agenda is exactly. So You're muted, Judge.
Sorry. Yeah,
Yep.
no. This is the purpose of the meeting to have the presentation, and then ask questions about it. And our agenda is it's short just because we have to file a report on the 13th of January, but we're
Yep.
kind of wide open, Joe.
Okay. So I think I'll start with slide 33, Eli. And so a lot of the maximum, a lot of the potential, I think I'm basing it on the one you sent out a while ago. So yeah, it's basically the max res achievable. Well, commercial but go to the residential specifically, even more so. That show the different end uses.
Okay, this one.
Yeah, there you go. So, we've you've talked about how the achievable potential is to maintain current budgets, I think. It's the definition. And I was wondering whether there's any way to know, like, if interior lighting and exterior lighting, and possibly even the electronics. So if you took out basically, roughly half of those impacts there from activity that, may not happen, that we've already flagged as being an issue. How much, what else do you have a way to fill in to get it back up to the current budgets and know whether, so do we lose half, but we could get another half of that half back if we spent the same amount of money?
Yeah, so that relates to some analysis we're doing currently. So we were asked pretty late in the process to estimate the total utility costs for each of these scenarios and the societal costs and benefits. So that's something we're working through currently. And I think once we have that, then we could look and say, okay, if you did remove some of these measures, what would that do to the budgets? I mean, there are cost-effective opportunities. Like I mentioned, some of these, if you wanted to try to accelerate other things, you could pull some of them forward. It wouldn't really change our analysis with the assumptions that we made. And we've tried to identify everything that is achievable based on the kind of current levels of spending and levels of incentives and scope of the programs. So I think the information is there if you wanted to say, well, we wanted to stick around the same budget, and to do that, we're going to be more aggressive on insulation, for example. You'd need to pull some of that potential forward.
So, okay, so that is somebody like some schmuck like me or somebody smarter than me could go into the worksheets that you've sent us and would be able to back out the lighting here on this achievable potential and say the electronics, and then would have other measures that could be plugged in and have to maintain the same cost.
So we do have, we have all the measures in there. We didn't forecast potential past 2029. So it's not like you'll have a 2030 value you could pull forward, but you could say, well, what if we achieved, we really focused on these other measures that are cost effective in the business as usual. You could increase the potential associated with those.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not talking about pulling anything forward, just replacing things that are pretty much gone. Okay. And so you said that your assumptions make it not possible to meet goal. You said it a couple of times. I'm just wondering, are there assumptions that you would change, or were you suggesting some of your assumptions are conservative, or if you would have, or are you putting? I kind of thought you were putting everything, in the kitchen sink.
Well, I mean, I think I'd probably start by answering relative to that goal. I think that was a pretty rough estimate that MDE was able to provide. And we know that we're not including all behind the meter resources in this study. We're not including customer generation. We're not including transportation electrification. We're not including industrial electrification. We're not including batteries and their impact on potential GHGs. So I think MDE, we appreciate the guidance they gave us, and I think they would recognize that it's a pretty rough estimate of what would be required from the buildings to hit the overall state goal. From our perspective, we did try to include everything that fell within the resources we were analyzing. But there are these limiting assumptions that we did make. I think it would change things if we assumed that you're going to go in and pull out working furnaces and electrify them, and that would increase the cost. It would accelerate the impacts, but it might not be cost effective anymore. So I don't think we would necessarily change anything. I think it was an interesting finding, but I think it's also just a limitation of the information that we have and the way the goal was developed, in terms of, it wasn't developed this way to say Empower should contribute this much. We had to just use an assumption to come up with this dashed black line. And then, that's just kind of MDE's working on trying to allocate a statewide goal to the Empower utilities, and in advance of other work they're going to be doing to align with the Climate Solutions Now Act.
So just so I make sure I'm clear, so I'm hearing you say that it's not like you left measures out, or there was other things that you would pull in to the an energy efficiency scope. It's just that there's other things you could do outside of energy efficiency, except for the retrofit, or not retrofit, but early replacement. So you're assuming everything's either retrofit or time of sale, no early replacement. So that would be one where you could get some bang, although the question is whether it would be cost effective or not.
Right. Yeah. If we ran this study over 20 years, we would expect these lines to continue to decline. And then you could think about, well, how much should we try to accelerate the adoption of some of those measures, like the retrofit measures. But we did just focus on this 6-year time period, and also recognizing that doesn't align perfectly with the state's goals, which are based on 2031, and this is going through 2029 for the next 2 program cycles.
Okay. And then
hey Joe, I know you probably have a ton of questions, which is great, but I got a couple other folks that have their hands up. You mind if I come back to you? They may have questions on stuff you raised. First we'll go to Bob and then Jackie. Bob, you got your hand up, sir.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there on the the question I had was on the PEPCO slide. There's a comment that the electrification measures were not cost effective. Could you go into that a little bit, please?
Bob, and who are you with, sir?
I'm with the town of Washington Grove.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
On which side? On the utility specific side?
On the PEPCO slide that you didn't review, but is in the pack. 45, I believe.
This slide that I have up now?
No, the 40. Yes, that's the one. I'm sure.
Okay. Yeah. So we definitely did find that a lot of electrification was cost effective, mostly on the residential side. On commercial, we tended to find that it wasn't cost effective. So that's really what this is indicating here, that you still see that in the economic potential, there's a significant amount of cost-effective electrification, and then in the achievable case. But this is just describing why there's a big drop between the technical and the economic potential.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All right, and thank you, sir. And Jackie?
Hi, this is Jackie Berger from Apprise. We're doing some consulting for DHCD and providing some analysis of the savings potential from efficiency, just to compare to some other estimates they had. So I just had a couple of questions about the methodology for savings. The first one is I think you said for electrification, you were looking at changes at the time of natural replacement. Is that true for energy efficiency as well?
It depends by the measure type. So for equipment measures, yes. So for your air conditioners and your lighting and those other types of pieces of equipment, that we do assume that the decision is at the time of replacement. You can either install a minimum standard or you can upgrade to an efficient unit. For those retrofit measures, like insulation, like air sealing, things like that, then those are not a time of replacement. Those are assumed to just occur over a 20-year period.
Okay. And so then my second question was about that 20-year period. In the economic potential scenario, I think we read that the retrofit measures are captured at the rate of 1/20th per year. So does that mean that if you took the 1-year savings times 20, then everybody would be, who had the potential, would be captured?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I think so. So we are, often when we do these studies, we assess the potential over a 20-year period. That's probably the industry standard. This study was a little different because it was confined to the 6 years of the next 2 program cycles. So we assume if we were running a 20-year study here, essentially we would be assuming that you capture all of the retrofit opportunities, or depending on the scenario, all of the cost-effective and achievable retrofit opportunities over the 20-year period. But because we're only looking at 6 years here, we're assuming you're only getting 3/10, 30% of them in this 6-year window. And
okay,
then,
so only 3/10 of the potential savings.
yes, and then the other thing I'd note is that because that the everything we're presenting here is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and those emissions on the electric side are declining over time, if you were to just those savings that you might get in the last 14 years are probably going to be lower on a GHG basis because the assumed emissions rates are declining.
Right. So the GHG is reducing, but not the kWh.
Right. And the
Okay,
kWh may be increasing a little bit because of new construction or economic factors.
And then thank you. My last question is, where do you look at the number of households who are doing something in a particular year, or the number of square foot of roofs that are doing something in a particular year? Can you just give me a high level information on how you come up with those numbers?
Sure. So we start with the market characterization. So for each of the utilities, using their billing data, we came up with the assumed number of customers by each segment and by each sector and segment. So number of single family homes, number of offices, or typically on the commercial side, it is per square foot. So square feet of office space, square feet of retail space. So that really that's the baseline. Then thinking about the residential side, we'll look and say what percent of those single family homes have air conditioners. And then we know, we're estimating the number of air conditioners that are in homes today. And then our model models the turnover of those units. So that's how we know how many units are available to be upgraded each year. Similarly, for the retrofit measures, we have the total number of homes, and we have applicability assumptions about the percent of those homes that could receive those measures. And that information is all in the detailed energy efficiency and building electrification results in the workbook. So we have, for each of the scenarios, you can see this, and for every measure of permutation across utility, sector, segment, end use, you can see the assumed number of installations in each year.
Okay, great, thanks. And then the last thing, just as Sammy was asking, I'm also very interested to know what the definition of low income is. So if you can provide that when you have a chance, that would be really appreciated.
Hi, this is Ken. I've actually looked that up on the side since that question was asked the first time. We are using 200% of the federal poverty level. 200%. That was the agreed upon metric when we were starting the market characterization, yes.
Okay, thanks so much for the information.
All right, we'll go Garrett and then back to Joe.
Thanks, Judge. Garrett Fitzgerald with Montgomery County. So, and Eli, I appreciate the comment that you just made about how we're looking here at a 6-year study. I would imagine that if we were looking at for example, a 20-year study, some of the benefits of some of the electrification movement might become more and more pronounced over the course of that time. And I think that's something that we'll all want to think about as we shift into thinking about what the study means for future planning. My question is, going back to the original scenarios that you defined here. You showed a scenario looking at total technical potential, then you showed scenarios around that ultimately got all the way to business as usual. You mentioned that technical potential scenario includes, it helps sees us getting a lot more done than what is considered cost effective. My question is, were you able to summarize the overall cost effectiveness of the technical potential scenario? Just how different is in cost effectiveness is the full body of what we could do under the technical potential scenario as compared to those other scenarios?
Great question. So no, that isn't something we typically do. I think it would be interesting to see. We are including a lot of, you can see here, a lot of opportunities are falling out here when we get from technical to economic. So this at least gives you some idea of how much of it is not cost effective. It's possible that when you roll everything together, on average, probably not everything is cost effective, but you could move that line to a point where even you might be including a lot of non-cost effective measures, but the whole portfolio would be cost effective. So I think that's probably something when it comes to goal setting, how the portfolios will be judged. But the short answer to the question is no, we haven't attempted to estimate the cost effectiveness of the technical potential.
Thanks.
Joe, you still with us, sir?
I'm still here.
All right.
I think my questions are well. I just want to let everybody know why I'm asking the questions I'm asking. Mostly I'm afraid AEG is going to be gone and we're going to have to figure out how to align the study results with the goal structure as currently designed and approved by the commission. And there were some ways, some things that have been adjusted, like doing the life cycle GHG emissions reductions, but there's still quite a bit of things when I try to think about how we would translate these results to the goal as currently structured that I'm challenged by. And I think it ultimately goes to, probably the biggest one is related to cost effectiveness. And as Garrison just alluded to, or somebody did, that we got a situation where the commission has approved, and traditionally we've had a portfolio level cost effectiveness requirement, but the results are not presented that way. These are results at the measure level, and we discussed that briefly at the last meeting of the potential study group. And so when I look at the technical potential, the economic potential, I can't let's take out the lighting, we take out at least some of those desktop computers, and we're filling back in to figure out what is the even potential business as usual, meaning at current level budgets. I'm not quite sure I could go into the worksheets that we have and make that adjustment. And likewise, just, going to this question of economic versus technical potential. It's like, I assume there's not a linear relationship between the cost of the technical potential versus the economic potential versus the achievable. That I would expect it's a asymptotic, or not an asymptotic curve, exponential curve. And so, so maybe you could speak to that, Eli, about where y'all at in this in terms of your ability to help us work through those issues. Do I need to be laying awake at night thinking about this, or is this part of scope, or what?
Yeah, I think it's probably something we should talk more about, how we can help. The potential was run at a measure level. That's where we're doing the analysis. And as I tried to lay out on one of the early slides, we don't really see this as a program design effort. Certainly the inputs, the results of our study can inform program and portfolio design. But We weren't attempting to try to construct utility portfolios or budgets here or the specific goals. So definitely, want to make sure the results are as useful as possible, Joe, and maybe that's something we can follow up on. But that is, I think, that next step of how do you get from potential results to goals and also to program and portfolio design to meet those goals.
Dylan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. This on this subject, Dylan Voorhees with VEIC, consultant for OPC. Just following this same subject, Eli, you do have incremental costs in the worksheet for all measures at the technical potential level, right? And I assume savings numbers, not total benefit calculations, but at least some energy savings amounts. Or can you just speak to a little bit in terms of whether you guys are helping do that or whether Joe's doing that or we're doing that? There are some pieces, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some pieces that might help evaluate, say, and this goes to the other sort of gentleman's questions, things that are in the technical potential that might have fallen on the wrong side of the line by not as much as sort of other things that were like just way off. So there is some kind of pieces, some building blocks to sort of think about if you were building a portfolio and you were getting things that were not cost effective but were in the ballpark. You have some of that, right?
Yeah, it's not in the workbook currently, but that is information we could provide on the benefit cost ratios that we did come up with. So you could look at, okay, this measure that maybe it has a lot of potential, it's a 0.85 benefit cost ratio. Should we consider pulling that into the portfolio if we're managing to a portfolio level cost effectiveness?
So what am I looking at? I've got the workbook open here and I'm looking at one of the detail tabs and I've got the potential level selected at technical potential. So there's, hundreds of measures here and they have unit incremental costs, unit energy savings. Is that those are, I'm presuming those are measures. Well, what's the relationship between a measure that would be listed at technical potential that doesn't necessarily tell me that it's not also in the economic potential? Right.
So you would have to filter to technical and economic and then look at a measure and see, is it in both or is it?
Got it.
I think the measure should still be in the workbook. They would just have zero potential.
I see. So I'm looking at, I'm just happen to be looking at things that are also in the economic. So they do have those numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Potential in the economic. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And Eli, do those costs, so for those different measures, are these upwards sloping supply curves associated with these measures, or you just assume a fixed cost per unit of savings across all the different potential, or do you assume different ones for technical versus economic achievable?
They are all the same. So that is something we talk to stakeholders a little bit about, the administrative cost assumption and whether we should assume something different, especially for the maximum and the business as usual. So we're currently assuming the same administrative cost for both. I think there are factors in both directions that to get to that maximum, you might have to do more marketing. You might have to have higher implementation costs. There might be things that drive up the administrative costs, but also you might get some economies of scale at higher levels of program activity. So we chose to keep the administrative costs the same between both. But I think, again, that's, as you get into actual program and portfolio design, you'll figure out what are the actual administrative costs required based on a given set of targets. But we had to just make an assumption for the purpose of cost effectiveness in each of the scenarios.
So I could see that for admin, or we could, argue about it all day. But what about for incremental measure cost? That's what I'm concerned about, that, you're digging deeper in the well.
Right. So no, we just assume an average incremental measure cost for all scenarios.
I see. You agree that's directionally, that the direction of that would be, I would expect the technical to be more expensive. If I go all the way to technical, then I'm going to have a higher cost per unit than I am with the economic, than I am with achievable, right?
Cost per unit in terms of program costs?
No, in terms of incremental measure costs.
I'm not sure. So if we think about, someone's in the market for an air conditioner, and their incremental cost is the incremental cost of going to a high efficient air conditioner. Are you saying that in certain applications that incremental cost is going to be higher?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I would think, if achievable is generally, people are receptive and willing to, their clause, their utility rooms fitted or whatever. And, and they, have knowledge of it versus, a max potential I would expect to be, something much more aggressive where you're doing something different, and it's probably not just, I wouldn't expect it to be program cost. In fact, I would expect program costs to be, well, it could be, but program costs are going to be a relatively small factor, that you basically got additional, you're going from an old furnace to a condensing furnace. And so you got additional costs associated with that, for example. And likewise, as you move your way up, I mean, technical potential, I would assume is, the world is my oyster. I can go in and do anything I want to make that measure, fit, and, or pretty much, right? So I would expect the incremental measure costs to increase as you move up your scenarios.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we don't, and in terms of technical, the costs don't really play a role in that scenario, just because we're not including any economic screening. But yes, if you wanted to come up with the actual cost of the technical potential, you might want to apply some of those factors. We're using TRMs and other data sources to come up with those typical costs. But yes, if the feeling is that those are based on the what's typically seen in programs, kind of the easier applications, then there might be some additional incremental costs if you really wanted to go get everything.
So just to make sure I'm clear, so between achievable potential max and achievable potential BAU, really the only difference in cost would be an assumption about admin cost, or is that even different?
That isn't different.
Why do they have different potential? That's just an S-curve kind of adjustment. You're just constraining them in the BAU case.
Well, so when it comes to, because the incentives aren't part of the calculation, there is an assumed higher incentive rate in the maximum, that you would be paying more incentives. It just doesn't affect the cost that we're using in the cost effectiveness. So that's the biggest piece, that yes, there is the adoption rate, that we're assuming you're going to get lower adoption, and you're going to get there not as quickly on business as usual. But if you think about costs to reach the two levels of potential, the incentives are going to be the biggest difference.
Right, and the incentives don't end up counting as cost as long as
Exactly.
the incremental costs exceed the incentives. But that's what we don't.
They don't count as costs in the cost effectiveness screening, but they would when you get to looking at budgets.
Jackie, you have a question, ma'am?
Hi, I had one more question about the low income. If you know whether the number of households estimated was based upon American Community Survey data or based on utility reports of identified low income customers?
So I believe we based it on the American Community Survey. This may be a question for Colin if he's still on, or maybe for Ken.
That's my recollection as well, Eli, is that it is based on American Community Survey data intersected with the billing data from the utilities. So getting down to the geo block level through an interface.
Great,
Well,
thank you.
I have a hard time answering that based on the potential study, but in the baseline study, we used utility data based on participation in low-income programs, and then we combine that with the reports on the on the actual survey itself to flag whether or not they were low income.
Yeah,
So it might be lower than what's in the American Community Survey, which might answer Sammy's question.
So we typically use the American Community Survey for just that reason, because not all low-income customers may be participating in the programs.
Right.
And it sounds like there might be a difference in some of the assumptions in terms of the federal poverty level. So yes, that 200 versus 250, if that's what you're looking at, that could definitely be a contributor to the difference. But we typically use the American Community Survey to estimate the number of low-income customers in each utility service territory.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Joe, you're not finished, are you, sir?
Judge McLean, I am never finished.
All right.
I'm going to.
Yours.
I think probably the best path forward is for me to discuss with Eli or something and just kind of figure out what all, and maybe Dylan and a few other, put a small group together and talk with Eli and his team about what, how we can line things up and make sure that we're consistent with goal. We actually have, we got, the alignment is just, it's not trivial because we got a goal structure set up by the Future Programming Work Group, which was approved by the commission. And then we have MDE goal, and we have then the way that the potential study is set up. And so it's not just a matter, I don't think, unless maybe I'm, sometimes I make things too complicated, but I don't think it's a matter of just saying, okay, we got a 2% potential here based on the BAU or the max potentials, and that's what we would do with the, that's the goal that we would set for by the Future Programming Work Group. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And I hope not, but I think it is. So why don't rather than us boring y'all with all the tedium, I can set a meeting up with Eli and others, if others are okay with that. And we'll do that before the next meeting and report out.
Sounds like a plan, Joe. Does anybody else have any questions for Eli or his team? All right, Dr. Qualjo.
Thank you, sir. And Eli and Colin and Ryan, first of all, I think you've done a really good job. This is really comprehensive, so kudos. But I'm left with a little bit of this uneasy feeling looking at the chart that had the different potentials versus the dotted black line goal. Eli, if you can go back to that.
Sure.
I think I understand, but I want to make sure I really do. So you have your yellow achievable potential maximum, and you have the black dotted line, and they're not really comparable, right? I mean, because there's no way you can get to this dotted line. And the thing is that the dotted line is not a goal for Empower programs, right? This is the total goal across the state. So there are many things that are not included in here, like any kind of EV programs, transportation, correct?
So I don't know if anyone from MDE is available to speak to that. I think the intention was that this is not necessarily a goal for Empower programs, but it is how much greenhouse gas emissions would need to be reduced in buildings to hit the statewide goal. But in our study, we haven't assumed an all-electric building code or other things that even some of those that were recommended in the GGRA plan to try to hit the statewide goal. So there are other things that could be done even outside of Empower programs to try to hit that goal. But my understanding from MDE is this is an estimate of, to hit that statewide goal, what contribution should come from buildings?
What contribution should come from energy efficiency, demand response, and electrification in buildings?
Well, I don't even know that, yeah, it may not be that refined because there are other things you could do in buildings that are outside the scope of what we looked at here. So I think there's definitely that challenge of aligning these and, how much of this, what are some of those other things you could do? Like you mentioned, what is customer generation's role in this? Because I don't think the MDE estimate was that refined in terms of, or that they were able to say, this should come from energy efficiency or electrification versus this is just the amount of reduction we think needs to occur in buildings to hit the statewide goal.
Yeah, so this chart leaves me with this uneasy feeling that it is not possible to achieve that goal from the three components you looked at: the efficiency, demand response, and electrification. Something a lot more needs to happen before we can achieve that goal.
I think that's right, though we did try, to focus on what Empower Utilities' role is. So, if there's a new building code that comes in or new standards for equipment that are outside of what Empower Utilities are doing, that would affect these. But our goal here and what we understood from the stakeholders was to try to focus on what might go through the Empower programs. So this isn't to say that even hitting that goal isn't achievable. That's what we saw when we looked at the Empower cost effectiveness and the rates that we thought they might be achieved through the Empower programs. But there are certainly other things that could be done outside the Empower programs, or at higher budgets or at relaxed cost effectiveness or things like that to get closer to that line.
Is it possible to answer the question, what would it take to achieve that goal from these three different sources in terms of budgets, or what kind of cost effectiveness compromise is needed to get to that level?
So that's what we had intended to look at in that achievable case, but given that we didn't even identify enough technical potential, we didn't do that.
Right.
So really what our study is saying is, even if you could do everything we looked at, given these, some of the caveats we've talked about, even if you did everything, you didn't care about cost effectiveness, you got every customer to do everything, you still wouldn't hit that line.
That's the depressing part. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, sir, Dylan.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dylan Voorhees with VEIC again. Sammy, I think the biggest piece in my mind that could bring that technical potential, even given all the caveats that Eli, you just mentioned about this is sort of meant to look at Empower, and there could be many other things you could do kind of policy-wise to affect building decarbonization. It's that presumption of replace on burnout. That's the thing that could bend that blue line down, in my mind, to maybe hit that black line. And that is something that it was a decision, and it was transparent, and we had different views on it, but we talked about that. But that's not. It may even be cost effective to do that in some cases, not only just technically feasible, but it would be economic in many cases. So that to me is the biggest slice of opportunity. And Eli, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm making a judgment about it being meaningful or large, but to me, that's the thing that's not in the technical potential that Empower could achieve. And in fact, Empower does achieve that, right? I mean, there are instances in Empower where people replace a piece of working equipment with a more efficient piece of equipment. So that I'm trying to resuscitate some of your optimism about this, and I think that's the piece there that is technically feasible.
Thanks, Dylan. That's good clarification. Appreciate it.
And just to send you back into your depressive tailspin, Sammy, remember that half, at least on the residential side, a bunch of the savings right now are things that are not going to be in the portfolios, and this is gross savings, not net. So I agree that there are other technical things that can be added in here, but this is I think it is a dismal reconciliation with the energy efficiency potential right now, unless somebody's got some great ideas for other things that should be in there.
Go ahead, Garrett.
Garrett with Montgomery County. Joe, I think that was Joe. Could I just ask a question on that? So if there are things that aren't, when you say things that won't be in the portfolio, we're talking about some of the lighting programs.
Yeah. So
that stuff would still be part. I mean, it wouldn't be in the portfolio, but if I understand it, some of that stuff is happening anyways because of the direction that the market is going, and would potentially still be helping get us toward those larger GHG goals across the building sector. even if it's not part of the portfolio. So it's not, the news isn't completely terrible there. It just means that, yeah, there's less of that stuff that the portfolio itself would be able to include, and therefore it would be even less cost effective. The things the portfolio is doing will be even less cost effective, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure of that because it's not entirely clear what's in that baseline at the top. I would assume that it's including things that are already happening, but I don't, know that for sure. And so this one shows a gigawatt hour increase, but this is the gross, right? So this is, assuming code and standard baseline, but that other one I think was MDE, right, Eli? The one you had up just a second ago.
So this shows what we're assuming.
Yeah.
And this, in this blue purple line here, this this is our projection. This is what's coming out of our models. So if we were to move to this market baseline, this would decrease, this forecast, and go to the next slide. This green line would move down, the baseline. It would be lower. The other lines would move, but not proportionally, because now that lighting, for example, is removed from the baseline. It's not in the potential.
Exactly.
So that is something we've talked about, of potentially rerunning the models with the market baseline. We weren't able to do that on the time frame to complete the study here, but that is something we could do, is run with an alternate baseline with the market baseline to understand how that then relates to the target. But yes, that would, this green baseline is higher because we've assumed the minimum efficiency standard so that we could look at the gross savings potential.
So, but Garrett, to your point, to the extent that codes and standards are moving forward, then that does reduce energy consumption, even if it's not a program potential. It is this is not an energy efficiency potential study. This is an empower energy efficiency study, I think. So there are a lot of things that are going on out in the world. In fact, even without standards and codes, people, when they buy, just generally capital turnover, involves some improvement in efficiency often, or higher energy usage, and doesn't necessarily, could be more demand for energy services combined with efficiency, and you have an increase in energy consumption. But there's always, generally, things become more efficient over time. No argument there.
Anybody else? All right. Thanks again, Eli. I appreciate all your work and your team's presentation today. Got a couple other things to touch base on before we talk about our next steps. Scott, are you still out there, sir?
As long as I'm the only Scott, I'm still here.
Well, that was the one I was looking for. Part of the commission's order required us to address DHCD's specific greenhouse gas abatement goal. Do you have any thoughts on that, or how you want to present it?
Well, being that we are a state agency and an implementer, we're not usually in the business of trying to do policy work here. So really our expectation is to, listen to stakeholders' ideas, and, we will provide, professional input on, our administration of the programs, and, maybe what it might take to be able to do certain things. So we do have Sammy here, and we do have Jackie here also helping us, to come up with numbers to give us ideas, of what things may cost or what's feasible. But certainly we want to hear, from stakeholders and, where they think the program should go.
Sure. Okay. All right. Has anybody thought about that? I'm talking to the stakeholders, everybody else here on the call, in terms of DHCD. Go ahead, Dr. Quazio.
Thank you, sir. Just a comment. I think maybe I'm being master of the obvious here, but I'm going to say it anyway. That a greenhouse gas goal for DHCD and an energy burden goal for DHCD are not necessarily compatible. And I'll just stop here and maybe talk more about it later if necessary.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. I just wanted to make sure we gave folks an opportunity to discuss it. Maybe it might be too early to do so. Scott, yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
Thank you, Your Honor. A couple of follow-up thoughts on that. I mean, one is many of us are actively processing that potential study, which does have information about low-income savings potential. And there were some, I think, important questions about what the definition of low income is. And I sort of share, I think Sammy sort of had a reaction was that the low income slice looks low. So that's not a very technical conclusion yet, but I think part of what is happening and should happen is for the parties to continue to analyze that data about what it tells us about low income savings potential. I also appreciate that Eli and the team are working to try and provide some cost estimates, not just for low income, but for overall savings for those different scenarios. And I think that's also going to be pretty important for parties to be able to assert, possible savings goals, is to have some idea of what the budgetary implications of those are. And then the last comment is, again, maybe I'm competing for Master of Obvious, but the commission has asked for comments about goal setting in January. There's comments about the potential study, but comments about goal setting in January, I guess, at least on the utility side, but maybe there's, it's a little bit, there is some relationship between what the utilities are doing and what DHCD is doing. And so I think there's some crossover there that doesn't make our work necessarily super easy to come up with a DHCD goal on its own.
And so Dylan, we asked Jackie to be on the call too, because, if you remember, we had Cadmus do, a kind of a potential study back for the work group when we were talking about, the low income potential. And, we did see differences, some concerns or unsurety with the presented low income potential, with this potential study. And so we had asked Jackie to kind of look at the low income values and the potential study versus, Cadmus's and do some analysis on that to see, to see what the data is saying and comparing the data. And that we're kind of hoping that'll help to drive, looking at a low income goal.
I know that OPC and we would be very interested to see preliminary or any conclusions or results, findings from that, Scott. I think that's going to be really helpful.
Yeah, we're happy to share that data. That's what we're trying to do, is figure out the best thing to do. So once we have it finalized, we can certainly share it.
Yeah, and not just sort of like, here's the bottom line, here's how much savings Cadmus found, and here's savings potential Cadmus found, and here's how much AEG found, but here's why those numbers might be different. And that will be helpful in deciding sort of what you might want to base a goal on.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly, how Apprise is evaluating it. I don't know, Jackie, do you have any insight into kind of your approach?
Yeah, so that was the reason that I was asking a lot of those questions today, to get a better understanding of why the numbers are different and how we can make them apples to apples as much as possible. For example, the estimates that Sammy did, that Cadmus did, we're looking at the total potential based on the number of low-income households being served. And we were trying to understand, well, is this AEG study looking at, how are they looking at the number of households? So that idea that if you did this over 20 years instead of over 6 years, it would be all of the households. That gives us a much better basis for comparing and understanding why those numbers are different from one another. And we had a lot of important questions before this meeting today. So I'm really glad that I was here, and thank you so much for providing those responses, because now I believe that we're going to be able to provide a pretty good answer to that question. One of the biggest differences in the calculation is that the way that Cadmus is estimating the potential is they're taking the historical average savings from low-income Empower programs and applying those savings to the number of households that have not yet been served through Empower. And those savings, when you calculate that based on the billing analysis, that's using a baseline of what's actually in the customer's home, which I believe is a good baseline for low income, because they might not be replacing that equipment for a lot longer, even if it's very old. As compared to the AEG analysis, where the savings are based on the difference between the current minimum standard and the efficient standard. So there are those kinds of differences, as well as, the timing of the replacement, whether, it's only at the time of natural replacement. But those are all important things to think about when comparing it. And we're going to be laying all that out for DHCD to look at.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Scott and Dylan. I appreciate that. All right, so just I'm trying to get my head around just how we want to move forward, because as Dylan indicated, we've got there's comments due on the potential study just from each stakeholder on the 30th, and then we also have to file a report on January 13th on goal structure. And I kind of tend to agree with Dylan. It doesn't make everyone's job that easy. And I certainly don't want to rush people. I want to give them time to digest the study and think about how it's going to relate to the goal structure. But we do have a limited amount of time. Do we want to plan on meeting next week? Because if not, then we'll probably depends on how close we want to go to the holidays, because I know people start taking off. We've got three Thursdays before the holidays. Yes, Joe.
Can I get clear on whether is the goal structure under consideration here? In other words, we've made recommendations of the work group to the commission that approved a goal structure. Are we talking about mostly the goal?
Yeah, well, I guess and if I misspoke, I think I did say structure, but the way the paragraph reads is recommendations for goal percentages. So my apologies on that.
Okay. Well, the reason it's very important, Judge, is because if we did have some opening for making changes, we could do some alignment as the future programming work group, rather than trying to get everybody else to align to us. So,
right. Yeah, I think we might be stuck with the structure as it is, and we're just looking at percentages now, sir. So, do you guys want to take 2 weeks and come back on the 15th, or do we want to meet again on the 8th? And I'm deferring to everyone here because you're the ones who have to do the work and go through the study. And I know there's going to be some offline meetings.
Well, Your Honor, can we maybe clarify a little bit? One thing on the DHCD goal that I've been a little confused about, and I've read through the order, and some of what's at the end of the order is simplified. Obviously, that's the way those go. it's fairly clear to me that the commission wants us to try to find consensus on those percentages in the goal structure. So that's fairly clear to me.
I would agree.
And it also suggests that we're to attempt to come to some agreement on the actual goal, greenhouse gas goal for DHCD. And I want to check that against your or other parties' understanding. That's a different task. That's a sort of come up with a number well, they're all numbers. Come up with an actual goal itself. Is that the task that you see we're meant to try to find an agreement on the actual like tons of GHG goal for DHCD?
All right. All right. So I'm looking, and I'm not sure if make sure we're on the same page. I'm looking at paragraph 71 of the order, and it says the work groups to include the matter of DHCD specific greenhouse gas abatement goal and its considerations, as well as in a recommendation made to the commission. Furthermore, DHCD specific greenhouse gas abatement goal is to be addressed at the aforementioned goal setting proceeding.
Okay, so it will be part of their goal setting proceeding, but so I read the first part of what you just read to suggest we are supposed to work toward an actual goal, as much as I don't necessarily relish trying to do that on the next couple of weeks, but
that's how I read it, sir.
Okay.
I mean, the extent of how that goes, that's I'm not entirely sure. That's why I was asking Scott the question.
So without having talked to Nicole on this process question, my guess is that it wouldn't be useful to meet next week on the question of like, what should DHCD's goal be? Those other questions about the goal, those percentages in the goal structure, we might, I mean, OPC has more developed positions, I think, than some of the other parties. So I think we're ready to talk about that question.
Okay.
Where it's, whenever it's appropriate. But I think on the DHCD goal amount, we're going to need a little time to do some number crunching.
Okay, and that's fair. That's fair. Go ahead, Joe. Or go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
One more thing is so I believe, and I'm not totally clear on this, so it's really a question for the people who agreed to the non-energy benefits. On the non-energy benefits, there has been some new data that came in that would materially change those non-energy benefits from EIA AEO. And I was not clear. I thought that the idea was that we would be adjusting, and I was thinking in January, but I'm not sure that was the case. So the question is whether that needs to be part of the scope here, or would we just do that as part of the EAG, or as the authority elsewhere where we don't need to get into that here, or do we just leave the number as it is forever?
You know what? I'm not entirely sure on that, Joe. I don't want to say leave it there forever, but I mean, if we can work it into the goal percentages, I mean, I guess we could talk about it.
Okay. Well, it's actually not. It wouldn't even. It's kind of too late for that. It would be a change in the non-energy benefit, so it's not a goal percentage.
Okay. So I mean, that might be beyond the scope of what the limited scope of the group.
Yeah.
At least until January.
I defer to others on that.
Okay.
We've got the numbers if anyone wants them.
Okay. All right. All right. So I like Dylan's idea, at least for next week, to talk about the goal percentages, if unless anyone has strong objections to that.
Your Honor, this is Nicole Zeichner on behalf of OPC. I know that Dylan and I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I do agree with his position on the timeline. I think we would need a little bit more time for a DHCD goal.
Sure, no problem. All right, that's great. All right, and I guess we can circle back with any issues on the potential study as well. All right, so why don't we, at least moving forward, we'll plan on meeting on the 8th to talk about goal percentages. I know OPC circulated some slides. I don't know if it'd be helpful to have folks positions in advance, or if that's even possible given the timing. It might be beneficial to have folks provide, maybe some bullet points as to where they stand. Is that something the utilities could do and staff could do?
Hey, Chuck, it's Dan Hillary with Christian staff. I think we could probably have something
Okay.
for the next meeting.
All right. You think you could have it like to the parties before that? Maybe like on Wednesday?
Yeah, maybe we could do that. It might be late.
I mean, if they can have, if folks can have it in advance of the meeting, I think it just would make use of everyone's time a little bit more useful. Anybody
will strive to make that happen.
I appreciate that, Mr. Hurley. All right. Anybody from the utilities, can you guys do something by next Wednesday? Close the business, maybe?
Yes, we can make that happen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, ma'am. All right. So we'll plan on meeting. We'll go back to 10 o'clock. Apologize for anybody on the East Coast joining us. So we'll go at 10 o'clock on the 8th, and we'll be talking about goal percentages, and everyone's going to try and get their positions. Doesn't have to be a novel. If you could circulate that to the parties by Wednesday in advance of the meeting, that'd be great. And then we'll meet again on the 15th, talk about DHCD, and I guess we can continue the goal structure percentage discussion as well. And if we need to follow up on the potential study, we can do it then. Sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
All right. And Nicole and Dylan, I know, did you want to, it's only 20 of 2. Did you want to run through your slides, kind of give everybody a preview, or you want to hold that back until next week?
I think it would be helpful if people are willing. We expect it will only take about 10 minutes.
All right, let's go.
Thank you.
Okay. Nicole, do you want me to share my screen and go through those?
Sure. Thank you, Dylan. Thanks.
Okay. Let me do this.
There we go.
Okay. So our thinking was, since it had been many months now since a number of us had been thinking about this goal structure and these percentages, that it would be useful to update or refresh what OPC's thinking about these goal structures are, and having now the benefit of seeing what this potential study is and isn't doing, to sort of try to connect the dots a little bit. So I'll just walk through these very quickly, and happy to answer questions or just defer questions to next week. So this is the language from the order that's most relevant. It's straight from the order, except where all of these were X's, I changed them to X's and Y's and Z's so that we could kind of understand what we're talking about. And then this simple pie chart is an illustration of what these represent. And so there's a couple of different categories where savings would come from. One of those is behind the meter. So BTM is behind the meter. That dark blue, labeled Y is behind the meter. And then there are 2 categories of front of meter savings, which is FTM, one of which is this community programs, and one of which is utility specific or utility resources, which happen to then get lumped into one number X as well. So that some of this is a little bit algebraic, but it's just to reorient people on some of the questions that are in front of now this work group again. So what should those numbers be is what we understand the charge of the work group to be. And OPC has stated previously and remains OPC's position that the behind the meter amount should be at least 85%. So that just that Y amount, that blue amount, should be at least 85%, and that's that was in the future program work group. That's just a reminder that of that position. That's based on it's not based on some particular calculation. It's based on some principles. One principle of which is that Empower is fundamentally a behind the meter initiative. It's really intended to help residential commercial customers achieve energy savings like in their buildings, and that's fundamentally what it is. And so that number should be large. That should be where the bulk of savings come from. And secondly, that the current Empower currently relies somewhat too heavily on front of meter utility savings. So by our estimates, it's about 20% currently coming from non behind the meter, and OPC's position is that's too large. Secondly, wanted to frame some perspectives on the applicability of the study that we've just spent a little bit of time looking at. And a key point, which I think is obvious, but it has some challenging implications here, is that the study only looked at behind the meter measures. That's what that was one of the first things Eli said as he presented today. And so the study doesn't provide any information about anything else in the goal structure. It doesn't tell us anything about the opportunity or the feasibility or the amount of front of the meter resources, whatever kind they are, or this other category of non-energy greenhouse gas reductions. So things that don't have to do with energy use directly. So we have a lot of data, and we can go through it about the actual amounts of savings behind the meter. The study provides lots of information, and it may not be perfect, but it's a lot, tells us a lot there. But it doesn't really tell us how big that proportion should be. It just tells us an absolute number. So we want to really just be clear that we don't believe the study should be used to set a total goal. And that percentage behind the meter amount is important. And OPC says that, is stated, that should be at least 85%, but the absolute amount is also really important. And that 85% needs to correspond to an amount of behind the meter savings that is ambitious but achievable. That's sort of the phrase we've used for a while, and I think the commission might have used that term either. And that's part science, part art. But the idea is that it's 85% is important, but it's 85% of what? And we want that 85% to be a large amount, not just a large proportion. And we can kind of illustrate that, and there's only one slide after this, but sort of illustrate that this relationship between these percentages and quantities and how they inform goals. So here's a very simplistic illustration. Let's say that the study showed unambiguously, everybody agreed, clearly very simplifying assumptions, that there was 100 units of greenhouse gas potential from behind the meter resources. Let's just say that we all agreed on that. If that was the case, and that behind the meter percentage was 85%, then the total goal would be 117 units. And that's what's shown in the first column, because 85% of 117 is 100 units. So we get our 100 units of behind the meter savings, and some other things contribute to the goal. If you take that 100 units of behind the meter savings potential and you say, okay, well, then our goal is 100, then you've underutilized those resources that study has identified. And so in this second column, the misapplied goal, you would only get 85 units of behind the meter savings. And if the study shows, well, there's 100 units that's cost effective, that is available, that's a misapplied goal. if that behind the meter savings percentage was a lower amount, and that's not OPC's position, but just to illustrate this, then you would need a higher goal, a higher total goal, in order to correspond to capturing those 100 units of savings. So for example, if the percentage was 75%, you would need a total goal of 133 in order to capture that behind the meter resource. So the point here is that it's important to OPC that number be high, at least 85%, to represent that the predominance of Empower savings goal is met with behind the meter, but also that 85% correspond to capturing that savings potential. And we're going to disagree about that 100 units, but just to illustrate that point. And then finally, on the other percentages, OPC hasn't stated positions about what those percentages should be. One position that remains the same is that OPC, continues to prefer that those front of meter savings come from those community-based resources instead of utility-based resources, and doesn't think that investment in transmission and distribution equipment should be the kind of thing that you would count toward an Empower savings goal. That position is kind of informed by what's happened in the past and what's happening currently. And what's happening currently is it's only utility-based resources. It's really investment in what we would call T&D, infrastructure that is contributing the non-Empower funded savings to Empower. And so that's sort of informing our position. In fact, community-based resources, although there's some interest in that, they haven't been well defined, and we really would love to see the utilities or other parties provide additional information about what those might look like. And then lastly, that non-energy resources category, OPC supports a small contribution from that as kind of exploratory measure. And that would be things like low greenhouse gas refrigerants or reducing leaks or other things that are not really energy related, but could have a nexus with Empower programs, could achieve those resources. We're starting to see other jurisdictions capturing greenhouse gas reductions from non-energy resources along as part of quote energy efficiency programs. So we wanted to just summarize that and sort of give some update and give some perspective, and I hope that is helpful to people as they formulate positions or comments or bullets or what have you over the next week. Happy to answer any questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Now, I know I, for one, appreciate the refresher, so it kind of takes me back. Does anybody have any questions or comments for OPC now?
Sorry if I missed it, Dylan. Do you have a cap recommendation on beneficial electrification or how it fits in the portfolio, or is that wide open?
There's no quantified position around that. OPC does strongly support the inclusion of electrification measures and programs in the portfolio in the next cycle. But there wasn't anything in the goal structure that limited that. So behind the meter is inclusive of beneficial electrification as well as energy efficiency, and that's sort of parallel with the study.
And I would, on a related note, so T&D, when you say T&D, that's T&D efficiency improvements as well as any T&D investments, which obviously are a big part of the making beneficial electrification or making electrification beneficial. But that's just a separate role.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know what you mean about T&D investments being part of what makes beneficial electrification beneficial.
Well, the cleaner grid requires, isn't that the big challenge around a cleaner grid, in particular wind and solar resources, is making sure that the T&D is available.
Okay. So yes, that should be those should be done separately. That's not an Empower task, and we shouldn't be trying to squeeze sort of changes to the generation mix or the grid enablement of renewable resources. That's not an Empower thing. So yeah, but the point here is a little bit different, because I think there are things that can be investments in T&D infrastructure equipment itself, which can which you could call energy efficiency, but it's not behind the meter energy efficiency. It's having transformers be more efficient. That we don't think that's should be part of the Empower savings goal.
All right, thanks, Dylan. You got another question? Is it Yim?
Yeah, my apologies, Your Honor. This is Edward Yim from ACEEE.
Okay, I'm sorry. You come up as Yim Edward.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Yeah, I just wanted to make our comment that we support OPC's positions there regarding the T&D investments, that we also believe that could be a separate category for grid modernization, that making efficient T&D investment should be the new normal as part of an overall grid modernization effort that should be considered separately from behind the meter efforts of Empower goals.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Joe. Is there a goal out there somewhere on that, on the T&D side, or something in the works? I guess I'm just wondering whether there's, that has to happen somewhere, or the beneficial electrification could be problematic. And maybe it's just assumed it is happening or going to happen. I don't know, but it seems I still see lots of discussion around how to drive grid in particular transmission investments.
I mean, if I may add really quickly, I think there already is a lot of money being available from the federal government under the original Recovery Act and the ARPA, and also under EJA, to make grid investments in a way that are clean and efficient.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Edward and Joe. Anybody else have any questions for OPC or any comments before we sign off? All right. So I'll look for everybody's comments. Again, please circulate whatever comments you have regarding goal percentages in advance of Thursday's meeting. Try to have it to everyone not later than Wednesday. That'll be more beneficial for everyone. And we will see you then. Good seeing everyone again, and we'll see you again next Thursday.
Thanks, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.